Welcome to Kinship Cafe. I am your host, Jim Jones. So glad to see everybody today. And we are going to be continuing in our journey through the Daodejing. And today we are in chapter 43. So a little bit past the halfway point now. Just before we jump into the text, I'm going to cover a couple of topics or terms that are key in the Daodejing and will be helpful in what we're looking at today. And so we'll start with the phrase Tian Di. And this is in a straight up translation, just means heaven and earth. And the concept here is that we are getting it's a way of referring to the entire world or the cosmos, essentially everything that is. So this we just need to understand because there's a kind of a contrasting term called Tianxia, which means under heaven. And this can be understood in a couple of different ways, either as like a specific geographical land area, but more, I think, to the point, especially within the Tao Te Ching, is it's referring to the realm of human interaction or the human sphere of the world. And the translation that we're going to be looking at today from Chad Hansen likes to talk about this as the social world. And that's another way of talking about that realm of human interaction, which, of course, is what we mean by social. So we'll want to keep that in mind. But this is kind of a couple of contrasting terms that are used within the Tao Te Ching to refer to the area of focus. And so when we're talking about under heaven, we're really focusing on that human sphere, not just the world in general. And then another phrase that we've talked about in the past is wu wei, and frequently translated as non-action. And this is an interesting term, and it has received a lot of different ways that it's been interpreted over the years. And it's a little bit complicated because the terms that are being used here, way is what you would use for action or work or doing something. And wu is this term that we're familiar with in terms of absence. But in this case, it can be like not or no, or in this case, you can see how they get to non-action. But if we just take it from that in a very like literal sense, it sounds like it's saying like passivity or not doing anything. And that's clearly not what the Taoists have in mind, because they have all kinds of things that they're encouraging us to actually do. So we have to understand that action in this context has a specific meaning. And sometimes when you get into different subgroups within a culture, they will take words that are common words, but then assign a little bit more of a in-group meaning to it. So, for example, and to use just kind of a very crude example from our modern day world, we have a common English word of crib, which we can think of as a place where you put a baby to sleep. But in a certain vernacular, crib can be like a way of talking about your house. And this can be incorporated by a particular subgroup, and they can have lots of other words that essentially get new definitions within that community that create a little bit of a boundary between in-group and out-group, that if you understand how the language being used, this is one of the ways that it identifies you as being in-group versus out-group. So one of the things we have to watch out for when we're trying to look at cross-cultural communication is nuances in how common words can take on additional meanings or metaphorical meanings or some different ways of thinking about it within subgroups. And I think that's definitely the case here when we're talking about the Tao Te Ching. And so when we're thinking about the type of action, when they're saying non-action, that we're getting into the idea of socially constructed actions. And so if we think about under heaven as the social realm, the social world, then within that social world, there's different ways or actions that have been conditioned or things that you're supposed to do. So this could be different kinds of rituals or traditions, or even more in terms of thought process, it can get into ideas of certainty that need to be, or at least the Taoists are suggesting, that need to be very heavily critiqued. Do these actually make sense? Because so many of them we just acquire through the unavoidable process of inculturation. So when we're born into a world, whatever place that happens to be, then we end up picking up, whether it's language or other aspects of worldviews, all kinds of information that begin to impact and shape us in certain ways that are different than if we grew up in another part of the world or another time. And so the Taoists are asking us to evaluate these. We want to figure out as much as possible how to clean off these filters that have been imposed on us so that we can have access to more of an unfiltered way of looking at the world. And so what we might want to say here is this kind of non-reflective acceptance of things that might seem like they are just the way things are, but in fact, they're actually have been constructed socially. And in those situations, we need to really pay attention to not just uh, doing these things through non-thinking or through habit. But it gets a little complicated because they also have this idea of how we do want to act. And this is frequently translated as spontaneity. So, this idea of, well, what does non action look like? Well, if non action has to do with or with the type of action that they're not wanting to do has to do with socially constructed ways of being, then what non-action would mean is something akin to spontaneity. And spontaneity is going to have a couple of different flavors to it. One is going to be, how are we to react more naturally? And here we see the Daodejing making reference at least a couple of different times to a newborn infant. And the idea here is that what a human is before they get encumbered with all of the social information. So this we might even talk about as like human nature. What would that be? How would we just act normally in the situation if we weren't being fed all these cultural cues on what we're supposed to do? But then there's also this idea of cultivated spontaneity. And so they'll have different examples, especially if we move into Zhuangzi, who is a little bit more narrative in the way that he presents the information in his writings. One of the more famous ones is about a particular butcher who is able to just slaughter this bull without ever like damaging his knife or having to resharpen it, because he's so skilled at what he does. He knows how to get that blade right in between these spots that don't seem like they have any opening, like right into the joints there. That is a product of his skill that's been cultivated. And so when we think about that cultivated skill, this could be something as simple as, like, in our modern day sense of knowing how to type or how to drive a car or how to ride a bike. When you're going through the process of learning those things, there's a lot of effort that goes into mapping your fingers to where the keys are, to learning how to do a stick shift if you're driving a manual transmission, to figuring out how to balance and pedal the bicycle wheels. All that stuff, though, eventually, if you stick with it, becomes uh, non-thinking. When you're driving the car, ideally, you're not having to think about how you're driving the car. You're paying more attention to what's going on around you so that you can properly respond to things. Same thing with typing. A lot of typists, if you ask them where a particular key is on the keyboard, they don't know off the top of their head. They have to look, but they can easily type without looking at the keyboard. There's like that muscle memory or that thing that's been kind of internalized. And the same thing with riding the bike. You just do it, and it's very hard to actually forget it once you learn. So all of these we could look at as almost what we might call second nature, It's a way that we don't have to think about, that can become a spontaneous reaction to something. If we take this into the realm of something like martial arts, you have a very similar idea where you have to train to understand, here's some different techniques for how you respond to this type of action. But the ideal state when you find yourself in an actual confrontation is not to have to think or run through your mind about these different options, but to simply respond, to simply spontaneously follow through with what needs to happen. So it can appear that this cultivated way of reacting in terms of spontaneity seems like this other stuff that we're learning culturally in terms of ritual or tradition. And the distinction that is being made here, I believe, is in the sense of that non-reflective acceptance. So we may be receiving things from our cultural training that have to do with things that we respond to spontaneously, not realizing or being aware that this has actually been fed into us by our culture. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but they want to evaluate these to see if they actually make sense in terms of the larger, what we might say, agenda that the Tao Te Ching is presenting in terms of how do we get our actions in alignment with Tao so that we are uh, presenting more of a duh experience, that way of fully embracing that Tao patterns and ways of being in the world in a very harmonious way. So that would be a lot of information that's getting packaged into this idea of non-action or wu wei. And we can see this even additionally with the idea of practicing wu wei, which is actually a three-term process or word that is wei wu wei, which is doing non-action. And so that's where we see how these actually make sense within a little bit more of this broader context of talking about action. I'll pause for a second and see if there's some questions on this, because there's a lot of ideas. Rob, I had to mute you again because you got a lot of background noise if you're trying to talk. Any ideas or thoughts here? Does this make sense? Are you following the idea of what Wu Wei is trying to get at with this idea of spontaneity?
I think so.
Okay.
Sounds a lot like unconscious competence.
Yeah, that's an interesting way to put it. Because ultimately, that's our minds, our brains are constantly trying to figure out how to perform more of our daily activities without conscious thought. Conscious activity takes a lot of effort, it takes a lot of energy, and it's not very quick. The more things that we can offload to unconscious ways of processing information and reacting, the the better things flow. I mean, and this is where you can see, like, if you're driving home sometimes and maybe you get caught up in a conversation with somebody and all of a sudden you realize, I don't remember driving like for miles, but clearly you were. This is that more of that can't talk this morning, unconscious way of handling the information of what's going on with the driving that is taking up a lot less energy in order to do that. But it's the danger is obviously that at some point you might actually need to pay attention. And so usually if your brain senses patterns that go beyond what's expected, it's going to trigger an alert so that you become conscious of what's going on and then you can make decisions. But yeah.
Perhaps Maxwell Maltz would refer to it as the unconscious success, or sorry, the automatic success mechanism.
I like that.
That's from Psycho-Cybernetics.
Nice. So this is something that's not a bad feature. This isn't a super important feature for humans, but if we are unaware that it's happening, things that have been imposed on us culturally might seem as though they're just simply natural or just the way things are. And the Taoists here, or at least within the Daodejing, is really challenging us to evaluate those to see if in fact that's the case. And if not, then how do we develop other ways of being, this idea of self-cultivation that is more consistent with the overall program of figuring out how to be in harmony and balance with our world. All right. So continuing then, we've got one more phrase that we want to look at, and this is yin yang. And one of the we frequently talk about the different sides and the attributes of the different sides of this thing, but the key thing that I want to focus on here, and we see this even reflected in the symbol that's been associated with yin yang, is it's primarily focusing on this idea of change and movement. It's not a static thing. There's a swirl that's going on, and one side is transforming into the other and back again, and each side has a little dot of the opposite side, so that it's not strictly speaking everything is one thing or the other. And it's not that one is good or bad, but they are in flux and they are moving. And the more we can be aware of that and be on board with that, we can see, or gives us a tool maybe for how we evaluate different things that are happening in our world, so we can notice if they are, in a sense, kind of going with the flow. Are they participating in that movement, in that change, or are they pushing back and resisting against it? And the problem with resisting against it is it can get things out of balance. And so again, this idea of harmony and balance as it relates to this idea of yin and yang is that there is an acceptance that needs to happen of change and of movement, that things are not static. So a couple of things we need to notice here too is that there's an adaptability. So somebody who is skilled at interpreting the world through yin yang will know when they need to be more yang and when they need to be more yin. And it's not, again, that one thing is the right or wrong thing. But what is appropriate in the context in which I'm at, and especially in terms of maintaining that balance, maintaining that harmony. So at maybe a foundational layer of thinking about the distinctions between yin and yang, we have this idea of chaos and control. So yin, the dark portion of the symbol, has to do with this idea of chaos, but also can be understood in terms of things that are new or novel. And the newness and the novelty is things that are, by definition, maybe unexpected, and we have to figure out what they are and how they work. And then on the flip side, we have the yang, which is symbolized in the bright color here. And this has to do more with control. It has to do with the things that are already known, the things that we understand how they fit into our world, and that they're, a different way of interacting with those. And again, it's not that one or the other is ideal. You need both. We need to have constant influx of new things and novelty, and we also need to have a certain amount of control. If it's too much of one or the other, it can be, that newness can then start to feel like chaos, or that control can start to feel like, it's being very stifling or too rigid. But those would be at a I think a high level conception, the key categories that we're looking at in terms of that yin and yang. And so within it, we also then have this idea of flexible and resist. So the idea of resistance, the idea of not being flexible, is actually part of the yin yang, right? So that yang would be that more inflexible part. It would be the part that resists actually change. And so there's kind of this balance again that we have to find between that tendency towards control, towards things that are traditional or ritual or the way that they're supposed to be, and making space for that novelty, that newness, how do they both fit together? But even when we come across this tendency for resistance, that's actually still part of this whole thing. And then we might look at this as kind of the distinction between the creativity part and the tradition part. That if we recognize that change and that movement, this is where new things can happen. This is where the creativity happens. And then there's the counterbalance to that, which is the tradition. This is the way we've always done it. Why would we do something new? And these things have to be in a certain amount of balance. If they get out of balance, that's when we get into trouble. So let's jump in then to chapter 43. Starts off by saying the most yielding in the social world lopes past the most firm. So when we're talking about yielding, we're talking about something that is flexible and able to navigate in different ways. And the frequent allusion to this in the Daodejing is water, very flexible. It can go all over the place. And how does it deal with things that are most firm, like rock or metal? Well, it can just ride over them, or it can go around them, or with enough pressure and time, it can actually go right through them. It's kind of picking up on that idea that we see that the softest thing in the world overcomes the hardest thing in the world. Here we have this little bit more of kind of an agility way of looking at it, with this idea of lopes or gallops is kind of where that original term is coming from.
I thought maybe it was talking about the tortoise and the hare.
Well, you have that kind of an idea too, right? That there's two different ways that they're being approached, but I think um, it might be so with the tortoise and the hare, you've got the slow, right? The tortoise is like a constancy in terms of movement that ultimately does better than sporadic hopping around that the rabbit is doing. Um, in this case, though, I think they're making the case about agility versus fixity, the ability to be flexible versus inflexible. And that when something is more flexible or more agile, it can run circles around something that isn't, something that's fixed, something that's not moving or resisting change. And again, note here that it's saying the social world. So this is that Tianxia, this idea of, you know, everything under heaven or within that realm of human activity. So because we're talking about that realm of human activity, this gives us a little bit of a clue as to where this yielding and this firm is coming into play. These are dealing with social conditions, and that the flexible or agile mind is going to be able to work maybe faster, better, more opportunities than the mind that is fixed and unbending and stuck in a particular way. So, what we can also notice here at the beginning is this is functioning kind of like a strategy now. So, if we're thinking about how is the program that's being presented in the Tao Te Ching come into play in terms of how does this play out in the social political realm, here's one of the first ideas is that if we're embracing that yin yang approach and we recognize that flexibility and that change and that movement, that we're going to be able to we'll find ourselves more agile, with more capabilities perhaps than the social way that is more fixed and unchanging and resistant to change. And it continues then, and it says, that which lacks presence enters into that which lacks space. And again, if we're thinking about kind of the physical parallels of like water and hard surfaces, even this thing that seems like it's just almost like nothing in terms of water somehow finds its way into these cracks and fissures and explosion, you know, takes advantage of those spaces that seem like they're impenetrable otherwise, but somehow it's entering in and ultimately changing things because of its ability to go into places that otherwise don't seem accessible. So if we think about that back into this social world, if something, so if we think about the flexible and inflexible in terms of how people are approaching or thinking or perceiving the world that we see in the first phrase here, then the corollary of the firm or the fixed would be that which lacks space. So it's kind of like the idea that somebody's mind is already filled up or it's not open to new ideas, right? And so something that lacks presence somehow is able to enter into that. Now, if we're talking about this yielding or flexible or this, dynamically changing concepts, maybe what's happening here is there's ideas or examples even that have the ability to penetrate into those minds that seem like they're fixed. And so maybe they're ideas that are getting picked up, not so much because somebody's arguing, right? Because when we get into a debate with somebody or trying to challenge ideas head on and we're having discussions, that doesn't really seem to act very well, right? We how often do you find that if you are engaged in a conflict of ideas that the louder you speak or the more you pile up evidence on your side that actually ever works? It's like people just kind of shut down, draw the line in the sand, even if it becomes something where they appear to be very irrational about it, at least from our perspective. So another way that we might actually get in and allow that change to happen or to enter that space is through non-coercive, non-confrontational ways of being, where we're not approaching like trying to say this is the truth or this is what's right or you need to be able to see this or you're not being rational. And perhaps what's happening then is they're getting exposed to or witnessing a way of being that is contrary to what they were expecting. So, one of the ways that I see this happening from a social world perspective, I see a lot in what happens with race relations. So, when we have very strong racism happening, where people are told, people of this race are a certain way, maybe they're all lazy or they're all unintelligent or they, whatever kind of pejorative way they're being presented, right? And somebody doesn't know any different. They grow up in a particular class where this is the general norm of how they think about this other class of people. But then one day they start to come in contact with them, or they happen to see how they are in their environment, and all of a sudden, all these categories that they've been told about these people, they start to see and witness or maybe even experience something entirely different. And this, what was this movie? Well, there's been multiple different movies about like the early days in America where there's, the cowboys and the Indians, right? And the Indians are always these savages. And then you have these stories of people who end up living with the Indians for some reason. And all of a sudden they discover a whole different way of life that they're like completely contrary to what they've been told. And now they have this whole new deep respect for the Indians and their way of life that they didn't have prior. And so that didn't
I think you're
happen.
talking about Dances with Wolves.
Well, that would be one. I'm thinking, wasn't there one like Big Man, Little Man? And
With Dustin Hoffman, right?
yeah,
Big
and
Man.
yeah, so I mean, there's a lot of the story is kind of recurrent because it's one of the ways that those transitions happen, and the same thing that we saw, in the civil rights movements that was going on, or with any of the distinctions in terms of classes, how those relations open up doesn't ever seem to happen because of the arguments, but because they see something that contradicts what their expectation was. And it's that contradiction in what they're witnessing that opens up that space for these new ideas or new thoughts to come in, which seem previously to be completely closed down or not open. And this can happen whether you're talking about ideological differences, like political party, or pretty much anything you can think of. When the mind is shut down because it has these ideas about what the other side is, um, if they're able to witness something that is contrary to that, it has the ability then to create a space for understanding or looking at things differently, that expanding of that perspective beyond what they had previously had.
Jim, I know this is a bit of a tangent, but this book, The Dawn of Everything, that has come up
Mhm.
before,
Yeah.
didn't that talk about the phenomenon of European settlers? Like the colonies had the problem of European settlers actually fleeing the colonies to go live with the Native Americans once they like discovered what their lifestyle was like, and the Europeans were actually converting to the Indian way of life because they found it so much more appealing
Yeah.
and less confining. So people were actually defecting to go live with the savages.
And this would be another one of those stories, right, where we talk about Pocahontas. And of course, that gets told in lots of different ways, but that's part of what was happening at that time frame. And of course, people like Rousseau were just fascinated by the savages and how they were living and how contrary it was to the idea of them being like these brute beasts. But then, he starts to develop this idea of the noble savage, and just a whole rethinking. He had, maybe went too far on the other direction and didn't really understand, but there was that intrigue because they did not live up to the expectations of what they'd always been told. And yeah, it was a very interesting time where a lot of our perspectives were shifting radically. So I find this, even though it's kind of very simple in the things that are being presented here in terms of these two passages, um, extremely encouraging. Like, this is almost like, here's how you affect change. It's understanding these patterns again, which is the concern with, what is the Tao, what are the patterns and way things operate. Well, here is almost like the key for how you get in to change things that seem like they're unchangeable, and it seems exactly opposite of what normally would be presented if you're talking about, political strategies, or any type of like social conquering type things. It's usually completely the opposite of this. To kind of jump categories for a second, I always found this kind of an interesting thing, but within Christianity, you have the book of Revelation, and in there's all kinds of symbols that can um, uh, lend themselves to a lot of different ways of interpreting things. But one of them is the number of the beast, which is 666. And within our popular culture, this has been taken to be like this, the sign of the devil, and something that's really scary and ominous. And it becomes like a key thing in the series, The Omen, and stuff along those lines. But within its context, it was almost kind of the opposite, that there was, getting into the way they taught and worked with numbers within this Hebrew way of thinking, there was more of a perfect number, which was seven, right? So if you were going to have like in terms of threes, 777 would be like the ideal. But they're saying that, here's this, the Roman Empire, and it appears impenetrable. It seems like this huge beast that's just rising up, and there's nothing you can do about it. And they said, oh, but by the way, the name, if you reduce it to its numeric equivalence, it actually ends up being 666. And what does this mean? It means actually that there's a weakness. It's kind of like you're seeing this big dragon that seems impenetrable, and just like in what is that in The Hobbit, where the little bird tells the archer there's a scale that's missing in the dragon, right? There's a spot, there's a vulnerability. And that's really what that 666 is getting at, is that there's a kink in the armor. There's an open spot where there's a vulnerability for change, for something to be different, and something that seems completely overwhelming. How do we possibly stand up to the Roman Empire in the case of early Christianity? There's the system comes with its own flaws that allows that opening. And that's kind of what I see here is we've got what seems like impenetrable social systems, traditions that are in place. And how do we ever even think to do anything about it? Well, it's suggesting two strategies here. This idea of the flexibility of understanding yin yang and how to work with that, because those who don't, who insist on trying to persist in the same thing or are inflexible, they've got a weakness, and that is that they don't have the agility. And the same thing with how do we get in and introduce these new ideas or hope to expand different ways of thinking? Well, that's going to be through this unexpected evidence through witnessing something different. Let's see if you have any thoughts on that before we continue. Do you find this encouraging? I find this like super encouraging.
I liked your reference to Lord of the Rings. I really have a picture in my mind now.
Yeah. The Hobbit.
Yeah,
Yeah.
finding a weakness.
Yeah. Well, let's see how this then continues to play out. With these examples, I know the advantage of not acting on constructs. Now, not acting on constructs is that term wu wei that we just saw. And this translation is kind of spelling that out a little bit more by saying not acting on constructs instead of just simply not acting. So he's bringing in more of the concept. It's not just simply translating the non-acting, but helping to understand the idea behind it. So this then, these opening phrases are giving like powerful tools for how do we affect social change. And then he's coming back and saying, with this, I can now see where that benefit is, why we need to evaluate that socially constructed way of being, and what happens if we don't fall in line with that. How can things change if we take advantage of that? Then he kind of has a couple of things that kind of pull this together. The teaching that is not put in language. So here, I think if we're asking the question, well, what is teaching without words or without language? It's going to be that, again, that example, and in particular, that unexpected example that is contrary to the expectations. Also, the advantage of not acting on constructs, how we don't just fall in line with the status quo, but we're challenging those, we're questioning those, we're looking at those actually make sense. He says, finally, the social world, and again, this is under heaven, right? That realm of human activity, the social world rarely reaches this level of being able to recognize how these things work and how they can work to affect positive change. We'll go ahead and stop sharing then, and we'll come back to our discussion time. So, very almost kind of deceptively simple chapter, just a few lines, but it actually opens up really fascinating possibilities and ways of looking at our social world and how we engage in it. And this could be not necessarily just in terms of political activity, but even in thinking about any of the social arrangements that we find ourselves in, whether it's some kind of group or club or business situation or local community issues. It gives a lot of interesting tactics.
Yeah, I think something that I've learned just through trial and error, I suppose, is that people don't like to be told or convinced or like argued to one side. If you do what you were talking about earlier and you just get louder and you try to back it up with more evidence, it almost has the opposite effect.
Mm-hmm.
And they just do it back. And I've found that in almost all cases, if you don't try to make yourself seem like you're trying to convince them one way or another, and you just show them, then they feel like they're discovering it on their own, and they're way more likely to be open to whatever you're trying to propose to them.
And isn't that similar to some of the things we've seen earlier in the Daodejing, where when the leadership is done correctly, the people say to themselves, "Oh, we did it ourselves," and
Yeah.
it's kind of exactly what you were just saying. All right. Well, I want to thank you for joining us today. And if you're watching this on video and you'd like to be a part of the live discussion on Zoom or in person, you can register your email at www.kinship.cafe, and you'll get an email weekly that gives you the latest videos as well as invitations to the Zoom conversation on Friday mornings or the in-person meetings that we have if you're in the Southern California area on Sunday mornings. All right, guys, take care. Hope to see you soon.
Bye. Thanks, Jim.